Karen demands kid be removed from restaurant for laughing too loud. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. It had been one of those rare Saturdays when everything had gone right. The weather was perfect, warm but not sweltering, and the traffic was light enough to feel like a small blessing. After a long week of juggling deadlines, daycare drop-offs, and a teething baby brother who had finally decided to nap like a human again, the Thompson family had earned a little peace. They chose to celebrate with dinner at one of their favorite spots, a cozy family-friendly chain restaurant nestled at the corner of a busy strip mall, where the scent of sizzling fajitas floated in the air and every booth came with a basket of crayons and a kid's menu that doubled as a coloring sheet. For Olivia Thompson, the 4-year-old ball of sunshine who had just conquered her final hurdle in potty training, it was more than just dinner, it was a big girl milestone. She'd even picked out her outfit, sparkly unicorn leggings and a pink hoodie with bunny ears on the hood. She was glowing with the kind of unfiltered pride only a small child can muster when they know they've done something truly grown up. Their server, a young woman named Kayla with a bright smile and an endless supply of patience, greeted them at the host stand and led them to a corner booth. It was early enough in the evening that the restaurant still had that calm before the rush buzz, with low music playing overhead and a few other families scattered across the dining area. Olivia climbed into the booth beside her mother, chattering away about how she'd used the big potty all by herself at preschool and didn't even need help with the soap. She giggled every few seconds, the kind of high-pitched, infectious laugh that was more like bubbles than sound, and her parents, Emily and Jake, couldn't help but smile along. They ordered quickly, a kid's mac and cheese with apple slices for Olivia, and a burger and grilled chicken salad for themselves, happy just to be sitting down with no screaming, no messes, and no rush. It wasn't long before Olivia began to color with enthusiastic strokes, holding a purple crayon like it was a magic wand and narrating her scribbles in great detail. Every now and then, she'd burst into fits of laughter, sometimes because of something she drew, sometimes for no reason at all. She made a game out of blowing softly across her straw to create little bubbles in her water cup, clapping her hands when they fizzled. Other diners glanced her way with small smiles, the kind you give to children being delightfully themselves. For a while, everything was perfect. Until the sigh started. At first, Emily barely noticed. A sharp exhale from somewhere behind them, a pointed clearing of a throat, nothing unusual in a restaurant, really. But the sighs became more frequent, more dramatic, like the audible prelude to some performance brewing just a few tables over. Emily glanced behind her and saw a woman in her late 40s sitting rigidly in a booth, flanked by 2 sullen teenagers poking at their food. The woman, immaculately dressed in a pristine white blouse and stiff jeans that looked uncomfortable just to look at, was staring directly at them with a tight-lipped frown. She wasn't just looking, she was glaring. And it wasn't subtle. She sat with arms folded, foot tapping rapidly, eyes burning with the kind of irritation that demanded acknowledgement. Jake noticed too, raising his eyebrows at Emily in a silent, "What's her problem?" kind of way. Olivia, blissfully unaware, was now making her toy dinosaur do flips along the edge of the table, adding exaggerated growls and giggles as she went. It was innocent play, nothing loud or wild, just joyful and imaginative. But to the woman in the white blouse, it might as well have been a war crime. She huffed again, this time loud enough that even Olivia paused, glancing up at the noise, then quickly returning to her play. And then the woman stood. It happened so suddenly that both Jake and Emily tensed in unison. She pushed herself from the booth with a force that rattled her silverware, squared her shoulders like she was preparing for battle, and marched toward them. Her heels clicked loudly on the linoleum floor with the kind of purposeful rhythm that demanded everyone look up, and some diners did, watching with puzzled curiosity as she approached the Thompsons' booth like a self-appointed sheriff in a lawless town. Without even so much as a polite introduction, she planted herself beside their table and leaned slightly over, her voice sharp and clipped. "Excuse me," she said, her tone full of authority and indignation. "Could you please keep your child quiet? This is a restaurant, not a playground." Emily blinked, momentarily stunned. Jake instinctively placed a hand on Olivia's shoulder. "I'm sorry?" Emily asked, more out of disbelief than confusion. She's laughing, the woman snapped. Loudly. Over and over. It's very disruptive. Some of us are trying to have a peaceful meal, and it's hard to do that with that noise. She glanced down at Olivia like she was something sticky on the bottom of a shoe. It's extremely inappropriate. Jake's expression darkened, but he stayed calm. She's a 4-year-old, ma'am. She's not screaming. She's just laughing. It doesn't matter, the woman shot back. You should teach her some manners. This is not acceptable public behavior. Emily sat up straighter, her voice tightening. We're in a family restaurant. She's playing quietly and laughing. If that's upsetting to you, maybe this isn't the right place for you to eat. The woman scoffed, appalled at the pushback. Wow. So you're just going to let her behave like a wild animal? What kind of parents are you? She turned back toward her own table and muttered loudly, people these days have no standards. Olivia, now visibly confused and a little frightened, clutched her toy dinosaur and looked to her parents. Emily leaned down to reassure her with a smile, brushing her hair back gently. It's okay, sweetheart. You didn't do anything wrong. As the woman returned to her booth with exaggerated exasperation, Jake and Emily sat in stunned silence. Around them, the air buzzed with tension. A nearby couple exchanged glances. One man shook his head. The restaurant's mood had shifted. Olivia, unsure if she was still allowed to laugh, sat quietly for a moment, her spark dimmed just a bit. But Emily wasn't about to let that woman ruin her daughter's night, or her confidence. She whispered something silly into Olivia's ear that made the girl giggle again, this time a little softer, and they all resumed their meal as best they could, hoping that was the end of it. It wasn't. Although the woman had returned to her booth, the air around her remained charged with hostility, as though the indignation radiating from her was strong enough to cling to the very walls of the restaurant. She sat upright, arms tightly crossed over her chest, jaw clenched so fiercely that the muscles in her neck visibly flexed with every chew of her now cold food. Her teenage children avoided her gaze entirely, their eyes fixed to their phones in a silent, desperate attempt to detach from the scene that had just unfolded. They, more than anyone, seemed painfully aware of how inappropriate and unhinged their mother had just acted, and they weren't brave, or foolish, enough to comment on it. Every now and then, the woman would crane her neck to glance toward the Thompson family's booth, her expression a mix of disgust and indignation, like someone forced to sit through an amateur circus against her will. The Thompsons, for their part, tried to resume a sense of normalcy, though the moment had clearly left a lingering discomfort. Emily made a conscious effort to appear unfazed, smiling reassuringly at Olivia and continuing to ask about the pictures she was coloring, while Jake quietly watched the woman out of the corner of his eye. His protective instincts sharpened. Olivia, still uncertain, had stopped her giggling altogether and was now scribbling slowly with her crayons, occasionally glancing nervously in the direction of the woman who had yelled at her. The sparkle that had lit her up earlier in the evening was noticeably dimmed, and that realization gnawed at Emily in a way that she couldn't quite articulate without letting her anger spill out. She hated that someone could so casually inject fear and shame into something as pure as a child's laughter. Kayla, their server, returned with their meals and noticed immediately that the mood had shifted. Her previously cheerful tone softened into something more careful, almost cautious, as she asked if everything was all right. Emily gave her a tight smile and simply said, "We're fine, thank you," but the look in her eyes told a different story. Kayla followed her gaze to the woman in the white blouse and seemed to put the pieces together quickly. "Let me know if you need anything," she added, quietly but sincerely, before disappearing toward the kitchen. The meal continued in relative peace for several minutes, but that sense of peace was fragile and temporary, like glass resting on the edge of a table. Every small laugh Olivia let out, softer now, less free, caused the woman to audibly sigh or shift in her seat in exaggerated discomfort. A few more diners began to take notice, side eyes and curious whispers trickling through nearby tables. What had initially been a private annoyance was beginning to fester into a public disturbance, and the tension in the restaurant was no longer confined to just two booths. Then, without warning, the woman stood up again, this time with even more theatrical energy than before. She walked directly to the front counter, where a young manager in his early 30s was standing with Kayla, reviewing what looked like shift schedules. They both looked up as she approached, and the woman immediately launched into what could only be described as a verbal onslaught. Her hands moved with sharp, slicing gestures, her voice rising in volume with each sentence as she pointed, repeatedly, toward the Thompsons' booth. Other diners turned their heads in unison, like spectators at a tennis match, watching as the latest development in this bizarre dinner drama unfolded. The manager nodded along with a polite but clearly skeptical expression, occasionally glancing toward the Thompsons as the woman spoke. Kayla stood nearby, her arms crossed loosely and her brows drawn together, saying nothing but clearly uncomfortable. After nearly 2 full minutes of the woman's rant, the manager raised a hand gently and said something that seemed to suggest he'd handle it. The woman, visibly pleased with herself, offered one final smug glance in the Thompsons' direction and returned to her booth, where she sat down with a self-satisfied huff and resumed eating, as if she had just delivered a righteous sermon and now deserved praise. The manager approached the Thompson family's table with an apologetic smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He spoke in a low voice, clearly trying to be discreet, but the very act of his presence stirred a fresh wave of frustration in Jake, who was already gripping his fork too tightly. "I'm really sorry to bother you," the manager began, "but we did get a complaint from another guest about noise. I just wanted to check in and make sure everything's okay." Emily leaned forward slightly, her tone calm but firm. "Our daughter is 4. She's laughing. Not screaming, not running around, laughing. In a family restaurant." The manager nodded quickly, holding up both hands in a placating gesture. "I understand. Totally. I've seen everything from food fights to kids doing laps around the salad bar. This is nowhere close to a problem. I just wanted to come over personally so you knew we're not siding with anyone. Honestly, she's being a model guest compared to what we usually deal with." That small attempt at humor eased Jake's tension a little, though Emily remained skeptical. "So, are we being asked to quiet her down?" "Not at all," the manager assured her. "I'm just doing my due diligence. Please, enjoy your meal. You have every right to be here, and you're not doing anything wrong." They thanked him, and he departed with a promise to keep an eye on the situation. But whatever peace that might have offered was short-lived. The woman was watching again, but now with a different expression, one of renewed intensity. Her mouth moved silently for a few seconds, her phone now in her hand. Then, as if on cue, she stood a third time, this time dialing a number and pacing near the hostess stand, speaking into the phone with the unmistakable tone of someone lodging a formal complaint. Her words were loud enough to carry across half the dining room, and they were absurd. "Yes, I'd like to report a child causing a public disturbance at a restaurant," she said into the phone. "The parents are refusing to control her, and she's being disruptive. Yes. Laughing, yelling, disturbing my meal. It's borderline neglect." Several patrons turned fully in their seats now, stunned by the escalation. A man at a nearby table let out an incredulous snort. Kayla, who was now delivering drinks 2 tables over, visibly rolled her eyes. The Thompsons were frozen in disbelief. Olivia looked up again at her mother and asked in a soft voice, "Did I do something bad?" Emily's heart cracked cleanly in half, and she reached for her daughter, wrapping her in a protective hug that she wished could shield her from the world's cruelty. "No, baby," she whispered into her hair. "You didn't do anything wrong." But in that moment, Emily realized that this was far from over, and she wasn't going to let it end with her daughter believing that joy was a crime. The moment the words Child Protective Services slipped from the woman's mouth, it was as though time slowed for everyone within earshot. Heads turned. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Forks hovered in the air. The weight of her accusation was so outrageous, so disproportionate to the situation, that it created a vacuum of stunned silence around her. She stood near the hostess stand, phone to her ear, speaking with such self-righteous conviction that one might think she'd just witnessed a felony in progress. "Yes," she said again, with chilling confidence, "I believe the parents are unfit." The child is making excessive noise, and the parents are refusing to intervene. It's disturbing the entire restaurant. I'd like to file a report." Her voice was too loud to ignore, and that was by design. She wanted an audience. She wanted attention. She wanted to win. The manager reappeared almost instantly, this time with a different posture, less of the affable host and more of the trained professional responding to a developing incident. He approached her with visible urgency, one hand raised in a subtle gesture meant to de-escalate without drawing more eyes, though it was far too late for that. "Ma'am," he said, keeping his tone even but firm, "you need to lower your voice. This is not an emergency, and you are disturbing other guests." She turned to him sharply, incredulous that anyone would dare interrupt what she clearly saw as a moment of righteous crusade. "Excuse me," she snapped. "I'm reporting neglect. This is serious. That child is a menace, and her parents are encouraging it. This is unacceptable, and I'm not going to sit back and let it happen." The manager took a slow breath and glanced around, noting the dozens of curious stares now directed at the unfolding drama. He lowered his voice deliberately. "You've made your concerns very clear. But you are creating a scene. I have customers who are trying to enjoy their evening, and at this point, your behavior is the most disruptive thing in this building. I'm asking you, politely, to return to your table and stop harassing our guests." She blinked at him, stunned into brief silence. The look on her face was almost theatrical in its indignation, her mouth slightly open as though she couldn't fathom that someone would dare question her. For a moment, it seemed like she might retreat, but then something in her expression shifted, hardened. "I want your name," she said. "And your corporate number. I will be reporting you too." He gave her his name without hesitation and pointed to the customer service number printed at the bottom of the menu. "I encourage you to call them," he said evenly. "But if you continue this behavior, I will have to ask you to leave." Back at the booth, the Thompsons sat frozen, watching the interaction with a mixture of anxiety and disbelief. Olivia had stopped coloring entirely and was now quietly nibbling her apple slices, her earlier enthusiasm fully drained. Emily's arm was wrapped protectively around her shoulders, while Jake sat angled slightly in his seat, ready to stand if necessary. It was a strange, surreal experience, being the target of such unprovoked malice in a setting that was supposed to be ordinary, even comforting. A simple night out had turned into a hostile public standoff, and it was taking everything in Emily not to stand up and scream at the absurdity of it all. The woman, realizing she was no longer being taken seriously, finally stomped back to her booth, muttering angrily under her breath the entire way. Her children, who had barely looked up through the entire debacle, now shifted uncomfortably in their seats, clearly wishing they could vanish into thin air. The tension did not immediately subside, it hung in the air like smoke, making it hard to return to any sense of normalcy. But slowly, as the woman ceased her performance and the manager made a visible round through the dining room to reassure guests, the restaurant began to breathe again. A few minutes later, Kayla returned to the Thompson family's table, her expression tinged with both sympathy and exasperation. "I'm so sorry," she said quietly, leaning in as she set down a fresh glass of water for Olivia. "I've worked here for 3 years, and I've seen a lot, but that was something else." She paused, glancing toward the woman's table with a scowl. "If it helps, you're not the first family she's gone after. She comes in every few weeks, and she always finds something to complain about. Last time it was a baby crying, and before that she yelled at a server for singing Happy Birthday too loudly." Emily raised an eyebrow, surprised. "And you still let her in?" Kayla sighed. "We try to give people the benefit of the doubt, you know? But this might be the last straw. Our manager already called the district office. She's probably going to be banned after this." She glanced down at Olivia and smiled. "And for the record, your daughter is adorable. She's not doing anything wrong." That simple validation was like a balm on a burn. Emily felt a surge of gratitude toward the young server, and for the first time in what felt like hours, Olivia smiled again, just a little, but it was genuine. She picked up her crayon and began to draw again, more cautiously now, but at least she wasn't retreating entirely. Jake nodded to Kayla in appreciation, and she gave them a wink before heading off to deliver another table's food. As the meal wound to a close, the manager approached their table once more, this time with a small white dessert plate in his hand. On it sat a perfectly round chocolate chip cookie, still warm from the oven, with a scoop of vanilla ice cream slowly melting on top. He set it down in front of Olivia with a kind smile. "Compliments of the house," he said. "And thank you for your patience. We really appreciate how gracefully you handled everything." Emily and Jake both tried to protest, saying it wasn't necessary, but the manager waved them off. "No trouble at all. We want families like yours to feel welcome here." It was a simple gesture, but it meant everything in that moment. Olivia's eyes lit up at the sight of the dessert, and she eagerly picked up her spoon. For the first time since the confrontation began, she giggled again, freely, beautifully, the way only a child can. And this time, no one dared to complain. Across the room, the woman in white was watching with her jaw tight and her fingers drumming angrily against the table. Her food sat untouched, and her children continued their silent protest by refusing to make eye contact. The manager caught her gaze and didn't look away. She seemed to recognize, finally, that she had lost control of the narrative. But it wasn't over yet. Not for her. Despite the manager's efforts to restore calm and the dessert that brought a spark of joy back to Olivia's eyes, the woman in white was far from finished. Her eyes, dark with resentment, continued to flicker toward the Thompson family's booth with a simmering intensity that promised the conflict was not yet resolved. She sat rigidly, her posture stiff and unyielding, as if bracing herself for a final strike in this unwelcome battle. Her teenagers, still silent and uncomfortable, exchanged occasional glances that spoke volumes about their own embarrassment and helplessness in the face of their mother's escalating behavior. It was painfully clear to everyone paying attention that this woman was not here for a simple dinner. She had come with the conviction of a crusader, convinced she was on a mission to enforce her own version of order, no matter the cost. Just as the Thompsons were beginning to relax, the sound of a sharp, insistent tapping on a tablet at the hostess stand interrupted the quiet buzz of the restaurant. The hostess herself, a petite woman with a warm smile, approached the manager with an urgent look. They exchanged a few low words before the manager turned back to the Thompsons with a serious expression. "I need to let you know that the woman called the local authorities," he said quietly, careful not to alarm Olivia but firm enough that Emily and Jake immediately sat up straighter, tension sharpening their features once more. "They're on their way, and they want to speak with you about the complaint." Emily's heart sank, and Jake's jaw tightened. It was almost unfathomable that this nightmare was continuing to escalate over nothing more than a child's laughter. "Are you serious?" Emily asked, her voice low but incredulous. "They're sending the police over because our daughter giggled?" The manager nodded solemnly. "I'm sorry. We're doing everything we can to manage it on our end, but once a formal complaint is made, they're required to respond." Olivia, sensing the rising tension around her, looked to her parents with wide eyes. "Mommy, Daddy, why are they coming here? Did I do something wrong?" Her voice was small and vulnerable, her earlier joy now clouded with confusion and fear. Emily swallowed hard, pulling Olivia close once again. "No, baby, you didn't do anything wrong. Sometimes, people don't understand, but we're here to protect you." She looked over at Jake, silently urging him to stay calm and strong for their daughter. The minutes dragged painfully by as they waited for the police to arrive, each tick of the clock amplifying the surreal nature of the situation. Other diners had resumed their meals, though the occasional glance in their direction remained, a mixture of sympathy and disbelief. Kayla returned briefly to check on them, offering a supportive smile that helped steady Emily's nerves. "You're doing great," she whispered, "and we're all on your side." When the officers finally walked in, two men in their 30s with calm but serious expressions, the room seemed to hold its collective breath. They approached the Thompson family's table with professional courtesy but with the unmistakable gravity of their duties. One introduced himself as Officer Martinez and the other as Officer Lee. They explained that they were responding to a complaint regarding potential child neglect or disturbance and asked to speak with the parents. Emily and Jake exchanged a quick, determined glance before Emily took the lead. Our daughter was laughing, she began carefully, and a woman here believed it was inappropriate and disruptive. That's the entire issue. We have done nothing wrong, and we were treating our daughter with love and care. Officer Martinez nodded, listening attentively but with a measured reserve, taking in the family's demeanor and the environment. We'll need to speak with Olivia as well, he said gently, just to make sure everything's all right. Emily nodded, understanding the formality of the process, though the thought of subjecting Olivia to questions while she was still confused and upset made her stomach churn. The officers spoke kindly to Olivia, asking simple questions about her night, her parents, and whether she felt safe. Olivia answered shyly but without hesitation, her parents' steady presence helping her remain calm. It was clear to everyone that there was no issue of neglect or harm, only an overzealous complaint blown far out of proportion. After a brief discussion between themselves, the officers turned back to Emily and Jake. Based on what we've observed and your cooperation, there is no reason for concern. The complaint will be filed, but no further action will be taken. We appreciate your patience with this process. Emily exhaled deeply, a wave of relief flooding through her. Jake gave her a small, reassuring smile, and Olivia squeezed her mother's hand, a quiet reassurance that everything was going to be okay. The officers thanked them and left, leaving the family to finally settle back into their dinner in peace. Though the confrontation was over, the damage done to the mood lingered. Olivia's laughter, once a bright and carefree melody, was now hesitant, cautious, as if waiting for permission to be joyful again. Emily and Jake did their best to reclaim the night for their daughter, reminding her softly that it was safe to smile and laugh here, in this place where they belonged. The manager stopped by once more, expressing his sincere apologies and promising that the restaurant would support the family in any future visits. The woman in white left the restaurant shortly after the police departed, her exit marked not by dignity but by a quiet storm of muttered complaints and angry looks that no one acknowledged anymore. The teenagers trailed behind her, eager to escape the shame of being caught in their mother's misguided crusade. The rest of the patrons resumed their meals without further incident, the strange disturbance slowly dissolving into a memory of a night that should have been ordinary. As the Thompsons gathered their things to leave, Emily bent down to whisper to Olivia, "You were so brave tonight, sweetheart. I'm proud of you." Olivia smiled shyly, her sparkle returning in a small but unmistakable way, and nodded. Jake handed the hostess a grateful smile and tipped Kayla generously, silently thanking her for her kindness and support. Outside, the cool evening air was a balm after the tension inside. Olivia twirled in her unicorn leggings, her laughter once again genuine and free, carried by the breeze as she skipped beside her parents. Emily looked at Jake and saw the relief mirrored in his eyes, knowing that while the night had tested them in ways they never expected, they had stood together and protected what mattered most. The world would always be unpredictable, and people like the woman in white would always seek to impose their will on others, but the Thompsons had learned something vital, that love, patience, and standing up for one's family could withstand even the most unreasonable storms. Their daughter's laughter was not a crime, it was a gift. And they would never let anyone make her feel otherwise. Karen pulls fire alarm in school because her son didn't win Student of the Month. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story don't forget to subscribe. It was an unusually warm afternoon at Oakwood Elementary School, and the halls were buzzing with the sounds of students eagerly chatting with their friends as they made their way to the cafeteria. The lunch hour was always one of the busiest times of day, with students lining up to get their trays, talking excitedly about their upcoming weekend plans, and enjoying a brief respite from their schoolwork. The cafeteria was a cacophony of noise as kids settled into their seats, some of them eagerly discussing the latest news of the class, others more focused on their food. Teachers walked around, making sure the students were seated and behaving appropriately, while a few staff members assisted in managing the crowds, helping to ensure everything went smoothly. In the midst of all this chaos, one student sat quietly at a corner table, his eyes downcast as he poked at his food. It was obvious that something was bothering him, his usual excitement and energy were nowhere to be found. This was Jeremy, a bright but quiet fourth grader who was typically known for his enthusiasm and his eagerness to get involved in class activities. But today, he seemed withdrawn, his eyes focused on the half-eaten sandwich in front of him as if the whole world had suddenly lost its color. His mother, Karen, had always been his biggest advocate, a woman known for her unwavering belief in her son's abilities, his potential, and his place in the world. Jeremy had always excelled in school, getting top marks on his assignments and contributing thoughtfully to class discussions. He was well liked by his teachers, and yet today, something had gone terribly wrong, something that had shaken the normally confident boy's spirit. It was the announcement of Student of the Month, and despite all of Jeremy's achievements, he had been passed over for the honor. Instead, the award had gone to one of his classmates, a boy named Ethan, who, while a good student, hadn't shown the same level of initiative or accomplishment that Jeremy had. The selection had felt unjust to both Jeremy and his mother. After all, Jeremy had been working so hard, and in his mother's eyes, he deserved the recognition more than anyone else. She couldn't understand how the school had overlooked him, and the feeling of injustice had stirred something deep inside her. As the school day continued, the atmosphere in the cafeteria shifted. While the students were generally oblivious to what had just occurred, a storm was brewing outside the lunchroom. Karen, a woman whose passion for her son was well known throughout the school, had quietly arrived at the school earlier in the morning. She had been informed of the results of the Student of the Month award before Jeremy had even heard about it, and she was furious. Furious that her son had been overlooked, furious that he hadn't been given the recognition he deserved, and furious that someone else, someone she felt didn't deserve it, had been chosen instead. Karen had sat quietly in the principal's office for much of the morning, her anger simmering just below the surface, but it wasn't until after lunch when things began to escalate. She had been waiting for the right moment, watching the students gather in the cafeteria, when her frustration finally reached its boiling point. She felt a sense of powerlessness, a sense of injustice that she couldn't seem to shake. It was then that she made a decision that would have consequences far beyond what she could have anticipated. Without warning, Karen stood up from her seat in the principal's office and stormed out into the hallway. She made her way quickly to the nearest fire alarm pull station, her footsteps echoing in the silent hall. No one paid her any attention as she passed by, her thoughts consumed by the overwhelming sense of unfairness that gripped her. She reached the fire alarm, her hands shaking with frustration. With one swift motion, she pulled the lever down. The loud, shrill sound of the alarm immediately filled the school, cutting through the noise of the cafeteria and echoing down the hallways. The students froze in place, looking around in confusion as the alarm blared in their ears. The teachers, equally bewildered, quickly sprang into action, ushering the students out of the cafeteria and into the hallways. The announcement system crackled to life, instructing everyone to evaluate the building in an orderly fashion. Panic began to set in as the students quickly filed out of the building, unsure of what was going on or why they had to leave. The evacuation was swift and chaotic, with students huddling together in groups as they made their way outside. Outside, the air was thick with the hum of confusion. Parents, teachers, and staff members gathered near the school's entrance, making sure the students were accounted for, while the fire trucks arrived and emergency responders began to assess the situation. They quickly determined that the alarm had been a false one, and after a few minutes, the building was cleared of students and staff, and the situation was under control. The school principal, Ms. Bennett, was fuming with anger, her hands on her hips as she spoke with a police officer who had been called to handle the situation. Karen had made her way outside as well, standing near the group of teachers with a look of self-righteous defiance on her face, her arms folded across her chest. When the officer approached her, his tone was calm but firm. "Ma'am, what exactly happened here? Why did you pull the fire alarm?" Karen didn't hesitate. "I did it because my son didn't win Student of the Month," she said, her voice filled with an unsettling sense of entitlement. "He's been working so hard, and he deserves that recognition more than anyone else. It's an injustice that he wasn't chosen, and I won't stand by while they reward someone else who hasn't put in the effort. This is a protest against that injustice." The officer blinked, clearly caught off guard by her response. Ma'am, you can't just pull a fire alarm whenever you feel something is unfair. This is a serious offense, and you've disrupted the entire school. There are procedures in place for these types of things, but pulling the alarm is not the way to handle it. Karen wasn't deterred. I understand the consequences, but I had to make them see. They need to understand that this isn't right. My son has earned that award, and this is how I'm going to make them listen. The officer shook his head, his expression hardening. Ma'am, you're going to be charged with making a false alarm and disturbing the peace. You can't just go around pulling fire alarms because you don't agree with something. That's illegal, and you'll be held accountable for it. Karen's eyes widened for a brief moment, but her resolve didn't waver. This is all for my son. I did it for him, she muttered, though there was a flicker of uncertainty in her voice now. The officer remained silent for a moment before nodding toward the principal, who had been watching the exchange from the sidelines, her face grim with disbelief. The following days were a whirlwind. Karen was escorted off school grounds by the police, and the incident was thoroughly investigated. Ms. Bennett, the principal, made an official statement to the press, emphasizing that the situation had been handled and that the school would take appropriate action to ensure the safety of the students moving forward. Karen's actions were viewed as extreme and misguided by nearly everyone, and though her intent had been to protest injustice, it had only caused chaos and disruption. As the weeks went by, the story of Karen's outburst became a topic of conversation among students and parents alike. Some were sympathetic to her frustration, while others saw her actions as an example of how far a parent's overzealous devotion to their child could go when left unchecked. Jeremy, meanwhile, continued his schoolwork, his grades unaffected by the drama that had unfolded, though he seemed a little quieter than before. The whole ordeal had, in a strange way, unified the school community, reminding everyone of the importance of fairness, of following the rules, and of approaching problems with thoughtfulness and restraint. Karen's actions, though extreme, had shown that no amount of entitlement or anger could alter the course of fairness. The recognition she had wanted for her son didn't come through her disruptive protest, but through the understanding that fairness, even when it seemed unfair, was a value that should be upheld. The fire alarm blared its deafening shriek through the halls of Oakwood Elementary, the sound so loud and persistent that it drowned out everything else, stealing the calm of the lunch hour in an instant. The cafeteria, which had just been filled with the noise of students chatting excitedly over their lunches, quickly descended into chaos. The girls in the corner, still recovering from the shock of the earlier outburst from Karen, now found themselves swept up in the pandemonium. The sound of the alarm sent the students into a frenzy, their eyes wide with confusion and fear as they scrambled to grab their trays and move toward the exits. Teachers quickly sprang into action, ushering students out of the cafeteria, trying to maintain some semblance of order amid the confusion. Ellie, still processing what had just happened with Karen, found herself moving along with the crowd, her heart pounding with a mixture of anxiety and disbelief. What had just occurred? Why had Karen done this? As the students filed out of the cafeteria and into the hallways, the chaos only escalated. The school's emergency drills kicked in, and every student and teacher was evaluated outside, where they stood in groups, some of them still processing what had just unfolded. The air was thick with tension as people gathered near the main doors, waiting for some sort of explanation, trying to make sense of why they were standing outside in the middle of the day, their normal routine interrupted by a completely unnecessary evacuation. Ellie, still shaken, looked around at the sea of confused faces, unsure of what to do next. She stood near a small group of friends, each of them glancing around nervously as if waiting for an announcement, but no one had any answers. All they knew was that the alarm had been pulled, and the school had been evaluated, just as it had during the regular fire drills they practiced every few months. However, this was no drill. This was real. Minutes passed slowly, with the students milling about in the parking lot, unsure of what was going on or how long they would be out there. The staff were huddled together, talking quietly among themselves, though no one was giving any real answers. The fire trucks arrived, and the emergency responders began assessing the situation, moving through the parking lot with purpose. It became clear that this wasn't an accident. Someone had deliberately pulled the alarm. That realization only deepened the confusion. Why? Who would do something like this? What could possibly motivate someone to interrupt an entire school day and put everyone through this unnecessary disruption? Ellie stood there, clutching her jacket tightly around her as she tried to make sense of it all. She could feel the weight of her confusion, the questions that no one seemed to have answers for. She had just witnessed Karen throw a fit over something as trivial as not winning an award, and now it seemed as if that very outburst had been the catalyst for the chaos that was unfolding. It didn't make sense. How could someone go from throwing a tantrum about a school award to pulling a fire alarm? Karen's actions didn't seem to fit together, and yet, here they were, an entire school evaluated because of one person's angry protest. The fire trucks left as quickly as they had arrived, their sirens fading into the distance, and the staff began to lead the students back into the building. The announcement came over the loudspeaker, informing everyone that it was safe to re-enter the school. The students, though still unsettled, slowly began to filter back inside. Ellie walked with her friends, her thoughts still racing, trying to piece together what had just happened. She had never witnessed anything like this before, and she wasn't sure how to feel. She had always been the kind of person to avoid confrontation, to shy away from anything that might cause trouble. But now, it felt like the whole world had been turned upside down, and all because of one person's inability to handle disappointment. As they walked back into the school, the hallways were eerily quiet, the usual buzz of student chatter replaced by the sound of footsteps echoing against the linoleum floors. Ellie tried to focus on the familiar sights of the school, the bulletin boards, the lockers, the classrooms that were just steps away from where she stood, but it all felt different now, like something had shifted in the very foundation of the school itself. The sense of normalcy was gone, replaced by the lingering tension of what had just transpired. When the students returned to their classrooms, things seemed to settle, but the air was thick with unspoken questions. Teachers went about their lessons, but there was an underlying sense of discomfort, of unease, as if everyone was still waiting for the other shoe to drop. No one knew what to say or how to address the situation, and so they continued on as best they could, going through the motions of the school day, though it felt hollow and strained. For Ellie, the rest of the day passed in a blur. Her mind kept drifting back to Karen, to the fire alarm, to the confusion that seemed to follow the entire event. She couldn't shake the image of Karen's face when she had grabbed the cookies and run off, her words echoing in Ellie's ears. "This is a protest against injustice." Ellie had heard those words in her mind over and over, but they didn't make any more sense to her now than they had when they were first spoken. What was Karen protesting? The fact that her son hadn't been awarded Student of the Month? The fact that he hadn't been recognized for his hard work? The whole thing seemed ridiculous, but in the quiet moments between classes, Ellie couldn't help but think that maybe, just maybe, Karen's actions had revealed something deeper, something more troubling than just a mother's frustration. The next day, news spread quickly about what had happened. It wasn't long before the story had made its way through the school, and students were whispering about Karen's actions, speculating about why she had done it, what her motivations had been, and what the consequences would be. Ellie listened to the rumors circulating, but none of them really provided answers. It was clear that Karen had crossed a line, but what was the true cost of her actions? Was it the inconvenience to the school and the students? The disruption to their learning? Or was it something more, something about the way people were so willing to escalate situations over trivial matters, to lash out in ways that affected everyone around them? Later that day, Ellie found herself in the school library, sitting at a table by herself. She had finished her homework and had some time to think, but instead of feeling relieved, she felt overwhelmed by the enormity of the situation. It wasn't just about the cookies being stolen or the alarm being pulled. It was about the way people reacted when they didn't get what they wanted, the way they felt entitled to take matters into their own hands, no matter the consequences. Ellie had never seen anyone behave so recklessly, so carelessly, and it scared her. It wasn't just about what Karen had done, it was about the way she had felt justified in doing it, as if her anger and her son's disappointment were enough to excuse her behavior. Ellie sat back in her chair, lost in thought, trying to make sense of it all, but there were no easy answers. She wished she could understand it, but the truth was that some things just didn't make sense. Some people didn't know how to cope with disappointment, and when they didn't, they took it out on everyone else. The bell rang, signaling the end of the school day, and Ellie stood up, gathering her things. As she left the library and made her way to the parking lot, she looked around at the familiar sights of the school. It was the same as always, but somehow, it felt different. She realized that she had learned a valuable lesson that day, one that she wouldn't forget. People could be unpredictable, and sometimes, even the smallest actions could have ripple effects that spread far beyond what anyone expected. But more importantly, Ellie had learned that she couldn't let the actions of others define her, and she couldn't let someone else's mistakes shape her future. She was in control of her own actions, and that was the only thing she could truly control. And with that thought, Ellie walked out of the school, ready to face whatever came next, no matter how unexpected it might be. The next day, when Ellie walked into Oakwood Elementary, the lingering effects of the fire alarm incident were still palpable in the air, but there was also a sense of normalization beginning to take hold. The students had returned to their usual routines, the shock of the disruption slowly fading into the background, though it was impossible to ignore the whispers and the rumors that seemed to spread like wildfire. It wasn't just the incident itself that had everyone talking, it was the aftermath. The confusion over why someone would pull the fire alarm over such a petty grievance, the fear that the school had been subjected to a false alarm, and the way the entire community seemed to be reacting to the spectacle had left everyone feeling a little bit unsettled. Ellie could feel it as she walked through the halls, the uncomfortable undercurrent of gossip that made her feel slightly out of place. As she sat in her first period class, the room filled with the low hum of student chatter, Ellie couldn't help but notice the subtle shift in her classmates' behavior. Some of them were still talking about the incident, but it wasn't in the usual way. There was a new, almost accusatory tone in their voices as they speculated on Karen's motives and the consequences she would face. Ellie felt a pang of discomfort. She had never been one to engage in gossip, and it bothered her that people were so quick to pass judgment on someone else's actions, especially when they didn't fully understand the reasons behind them. She didn't like the way Karen had handled things, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the conversations surrounding the event were becoming more about sensationalizing the story than about addressing the deeper issues at play. In the days that followed, Ellie continued to feel the tension hanging over her, but she also began to notice a change in the way people around her were responding. Miss Carter, their Girl Scout troop leader, had spent some time speaking to the girls about what had happened, encouraging them to focus on the positive aspects of their cookie-selling experience rather than dwelling on the negative encounter with Karen. Sometimes, people make mistakes, Miss Carter had said during one of their troop meetings. But we can't control how others act. What we can control is how we respond. We have the power to choose kindness, to choose understanding, and to rise above it all. Those words stuck with Ellie as the week went on. Despite the lingering frustration and the temptation to engage in the drama, Ellie knew that Miss Carter was right. The incident had been unsettling, yes, but it wasn't worth letting it overshadow the good things, the cookies they had sold, the time they had spent together as a troop, and the lessons they had learned about standing up for themselves and supporting one another. Ellie was determined not to let Karen's actions define her or her experience. She knew that the best way to move forward was to focus on the positive aspects of her life, to surround herself with people who treated her with respect and kindness, and to let go of the anger and frustration that had once clouded her judgment. One afternoon, after school, Ellie found herself sitting in the library, trying to concentrate on her homework, but her mind kept wandering back to Karen and the fire alarm. She had tried to push it out of her mind, but there was something about the way the whole situation had unfolded that continued to gnaw at her. Why had Karen felt so entitled to behave that way? Why had she resorted to such extreme measures to get her point across? Ellie had always been taught that it was important to express frustration or disappointment in a healthy way, but Karen's actions had completely defied that notion. It wasn't just the fact that she had stolen the cookies, it was the way she had refused to listen to reason, the way she had turned a small issue into a dramatic spectacle. It made Ellie realize that sometimes people's actions weren't about the issue at hand, they were about something much deeper, something personal. And that was what made the whole incident so difficult to understand. As Ellie sat there, trying to make sense of everything, she heard a voice from behind her. "Hey, Ellie. Mind if I sit with you?" It was her friend Sarah, one of the girls from her Girl Scout troop. Ellie smiled, grateful for the interruption and the chance to get her mind off the situation. Of course, Sarah. What's up? Sarah took a seat next to her, setting down her books with a small sigh. Just wanted to check in. How are you doing with everything? I know it's been kind of weird after the fire alarm. Ellie paused, considering her answer. Honestly? It's been tough. I keep thinking about it, you know? It's hard not to when people keep talking about it, but I don't want it to keep bothering me. It just feels like so much drama for no reason. I get it, Sarah said, nodding in agreement. It's kind of strange, right? Like, I get that Karen was upset, but I don't think she thought it through. There's no way pulling the fire alarm was the best way to solve that. Ellie nodded, her thoughts aligning with Sarah's. Exactly. Like, if she'd just talked to Ms. Bennett, or even to the teacher, things could have been handled calmly. But she went straight to the fire alarm. And then stealing the cookies? I just don't get it. Sarah leaned back in her chair, looking thoughtful. It's kind of scary, actually. Like, what if everyone just decided to act out like that whenever they didn't get what they wanted? It would be chaos. Ellie let out a small laugh, the weight of the conversation lifting just a little. Yeah, it's crazy. But I guess it's also a reminder that people deal with disappointment in different ways. Some people can handle it, and some people don't. There was a pause as they both processed the idea. Ellie hadn't quite thought of it like that before. Karen's actions, while extreme, had been a reflection of her own inability to handle disappointment. And as much as Ellie had been frustrated by Karen's outburst, she could almost feel a little sympathy for her. Not for what she had done, but for the fact that she had allowed her emotions to get the better of her, and in doing so, had caused harm to everyone around her. Maybe, Ellie thought, it wasn't just about the cookies or the fire alarm. Maybe it was about learning how to process negative emotions in a healthier way, how to deal with disappointment without turning it into something destructive. Yeah, Sarah said after a moment. I don't know. I just feel like it's something we can learn from. Like, we don't want to be like that, you know? Ellie smiled, grateful for Sarah's perspective. You're right. We're not going to let her actions mess with us. We've got to keep moving forward. The two friends sat in comfortable silence for a few moments, letting the conversation settle in. Ellie felt a small sense of relief, knowing that Sarah had helped her put things in perspective. It wasn't about Karen anymore, it was about how Ellie and her friends would choose to respond, how they would let the situation shape them, or not shape them, as the case may be. Ellie realized that she had already learned something valuable from the incident, something that had stuck with her more than the fire alarm or the cookies ever could. It was about being resilient, about not letting other people's actions control your mood or your direction. By the time the bell rang, signaling the end of the school day, Ellie felt lighter. She and Sarah gathered their things, chatting about their plans for the weekend, and as they walked out of the library, Ellie realized that she was ready to let go of the frustration that had been weighing on her. Karen's actions had been unfair and unjust, but Ellie was done letting it define her. She had learned that no matter what happened, she had the power to control how she responded. And that was something no one could take away from her. As Ellie stepped into the sunshine, the weight of the past week seemed to lift just a little more, and she felt a quiet sense of peace settle in her heart. She wasn't going to let one person's bad behavior ruin her day, her week, or her perspective. She had the power to move forward, and she was ready to embrace that power, no matter what came next. The following weeks passed by in a blur of routine, but for Ellie, the ripple effects of Karen's actions continued to linger just beneath the surface. As much as she tried to push them aside, there were moments when her thoughts would inevitably drift back to that chaotic day when the fire alarm blared through the school, when the world seemed to stop and everyone had to evaluate because of one person's explosive frustration. Karen's actions, as ridiculous as they had been, had a profound impact on Ellie, more than she was ready to admit, perhaps even to herself. It wasn't the fire alarm, or even the stolen cookies that haunted Ellie, but the way that one person's inability to manage her emotions had managed to affect an entire community. The ripple effects had been felt not just by the students and teachers, but by everyone in the school, and it was that realization that had stuck with Ellie. It was a sharp reminder that our actions, no matter how small they seem, could have consequences far beyond what we could anticipate. For the most part, though, things had returned to normal. The days in school began to take on their familiar rhythm once again, the students slipping back into their usual routines. The girls in Ellie's troop continued to sell cookies, and despite the initial setback, they managed to reach their goals for the year. Their camping trip was still on track, and Ellie could see the excitement on her friends' faces as they talked about the plans for their upcoming adventure. Slowly but surely, the focus had shifted away from the drama, and the troop began to look forward to their time away together, where they could relax and bond without the stress of the previous weeks weighing them down. But even with all the progress, Ellie couldn't shake the nagging sense that something had changed. It wasn't just the cookies being stolen or the fire alarm being pulled, it was how people had reacted. The gossip, the speculation, and the judgmental tone that had been used when discussing Karen's actions had left Ellie feeling conflicted. She was glad that Karen was being held accountable for her actions, but there was a part of her that couldn't help but feel sorry for her. The entire situation had escalated because of one person's inability to process disappointment in a healthy way. Ellie had come to understand that Karen's actions weren't about the cookies, or even the Student of the Month award, they were about something deeper, something Karen hadn't known how to express, and it had manifested in a way that hurt everyone around her. Ellie realized that Karen was a product of her own unresolved frustrations. She had allowed her emotions to dictate her behavior, and instead of finding a way to cope with her son's perceived injustice, she had resorted to taking out her anger on everyone else. The problem wasn't that Karen had been upset, it was that she hadn't known how to process those feelings in a way that didn't involve others. In the end, she had made herself a victim, a martyr for her son's sake, but the truth was that no one in the school had actually been at fault. Ellie knew that sometimes people did things out of sheer frustration or even desperation, and they didn't always think through the consequences of their actions. Karen had taken something that should have been a simple lesson in resilience and turned it into a spectacle of bitterness, not realizing that her inability to cope was, in itself, a larger problem. But as much as Ellie understood all of this, it didn't make the situation any easier to digest. She had witnessed firsthand the damage that one person's actions could cause, the way Karen's decisions had rippled outward and touched the lives of people who had nothing to do with the conflict. The students who had been evaluated, the teachers who had had to deal with the fallout, the staff members who had spent hours responding to the emergency, it was all a reminder that our behavior, no matter how seemingly small, could have profound effects on the world around us. A few weeks later, Ellie was sitting at the dining table, her notebook open in front of her, when her mother came over with a steaming mug of tea. Her mother had always been a steady presence in her life, someone who helped her navigate the ups and downs of growing up, and now, as Ellie pondered the events of the past month, she found herself needing to talk. It wasn't so much about the fire alarm anymore or the cookies or even Karen's outrageous behavior, it was about everything that had happened afterward. It was about how the world had shifted just slightly in the wake of Karen's actions and how Ellie had learned to process the fallout. "Mom, can we talk?" Ellie asked, her voice quiet but serious. Her mother sat down beside her, offering a warm smile. "Of course, sweetheart. What's on your mind?" Ellie stared down at her notebook for a moment, trying to put her thoughts into words. "I don't understand people sometimes. Why do they let things get so out of hand? Why do they act out like that?" Her mother set down her tea, giving Ellie her full attention. "People act in all sorts of ways, Ellie. Sometimes, it's because they don't know how to deal with their feelings. Sometimes, it's because they feel like they're losing control, and doing something extreme makes them feel powerful. But what's important is how we respond. We can't always control what other people do, but we can control how we react to it." Ellie nodded, her eyes focused on her notebook, but her thoughts were far from the pages in front of her. "I just wish Karen had handled it differently. She could have just talked to the principal or asked why her son didn't win. But instead, she made everything worse. And it's not just about the cookies being stolen, it's about what she taught her son. It's like she was saying that it's okay to just throw a tantrum and get your way." Her mother smiled gently, offering a comforting hand. "Sometimes, Ellie, people don't know better. And sometimes, they don't realize the lessons they're